Apparently books about technology, the future, prognosticating are my cup of tea, because I have another one. It's called The Inevitable, which sounds very futuristic, right? It has this very futuristic cover. So 12 technological forces that will shape our future, understanding them. That's the subtitle. And this book is written by Kevin Kelly, who was one of the founding editors of Wired magazine. I think I first heard of him through Tim Ferriss, his podcast. He had him as a guest talking about things like the future and so on, and how his best guess about what's going to happen. He's a very smart guy. He definitely has a lot of ideas and a lot of knowledge about the technology sector, Silicon Valley, things like that. So I was looking forward to this book, and overall it's a very enjoyable read, very easy to light read in terms of his style. It's not challenging. It's about 300 pages, and I enjoyed it for the most part. I even look at Wired magazine, so I'm kind of familiar with the tone and the style that this book also carries. If you don't look at Wired magazine, it's a science and technology magazine, but it also has sort of a sharper image catalog sort of take on technology. Everything is like this gizmo to make things funner, this kind of Toys R Us meets technology. I'm kind of cynical about it in some ways, and I'm cynical about some of the things that he talks about in this book. He's a very optimistic guy, although he does present some of the darker sides of technology too, which there are many. So if you can get past the sort of winning attitude of this book, I think you'd still find some interesting ideas and some things to think about. There's a quote on the back by Brian Eno, who's a musician that I admire a lot. His quote is this: "How will the future be made? Kevin Kelly argues that the sequence of events ensuing from technical innovation has its own momentum, and that our best strategy is to understand and embrace it. Whether you find this prospect wonderful or terrifying, you will want to read this extremely thought-provoking book." My intuition is that Brian Eno has some, he's also a bit cynical about some of this stuff too, but let's just go over a few of the things in this book and see what you think. I think the biggest takeaway that I got from the book is that, as the title suggests, this is inevitable. You could take any player out of this scheme of what the internet is and what it's doing, and any company even, and it would still continue. If a hole was taken away, if a hole was created, the vacuum would be filled with all these other 900 startups that start every day or whatever. This is really an inevitable force that no individual could really stop. It is out of control, and the fact that AI is increasingly being involved with decisions and how things are structured makes it we're getting to the point where even humans won't be necessary to keep it going. So it is inevitable, and it is an avalanche that nobody can really stop. One of the forces that he talks about is screening, and this is this use of screens that I've talked a little about, I think, but I mean, everybody looks at screens all day. It's more and more of our time is spent on screens, interacting with each other on screens, like right now, for instance. And it's something that I'm not a big fan of, actually. I try and spend as little time on screens as I can. And the fact that we're going to see more screens in more places, and that they're going to follow us and be on packaging, and they're becoming cheaper and lighter and so on, it's a bit nauseating for me. I really do try and spend as little time looking at screens, like minimizing my TV and movie time, even my internet activity. I try and work on paper as much as I can and just get away from screens, because I find that the less I'm on screens, the happier I feel. So I mean, it doesn't seem like it's helping us and making us feel better. We may be more informed, better educated, and things like that, but is our quality of life improving with all these screens? And my feeling is that no, and that's like one of the more hellish aspects of his inevitable forces that he talks about. So that's one thing that I'm not really looking forward to, is more screens. He addresses also this concept of digital socialism. I've heard different terms for it. There's another book by Jeremy Rifkin called The Zero Marginal Cost Economy Society? I think Society, here it is. But it's a good read. It has a lot of similar optimistic ideas about how the price of a lot of things is closing in on zero marginal cost, and how that's really changing the way our economic systems are structured. We had attempts at socialism, communism in the past with varying degrees of success, but they've always been they always return to this kind of top-down model. And what we've seen with the internet is these more bottom-up models. So I think it is a different experience, and it does seem to be better overall, but the full effects of it are still waiting to be seen. We're still definitely struggling with it, as you know, in the past few weeks, Donald Trump has been implanted in into power, and it's interesting. I don't know what's going to happen, because my intuition is that him and Steve Bannon are they're hoping for violent resistance from people. They want these protesters to get out of hand. I think he really does want that, because once that happens, then we can implement these emergency protocols, things like what happened after 9/11, where bills are passed really fast and it just gives him more power. So I think it's important that we do stay peaceful and look at other ways of altering the system. So I'm hoping that this digital socialism can alter the way that we do politics in a good way and not send us back to the past, but we're going to see in the next few months. One of these chapters in this book, one of the 12 forces in Inevitable, is tracking, which I think most people intuitively resist and dislike, and for good reason. You know, the revelations brought forth by people like Edward Snowden, things like that, have not been very pleasing. It seems like the government is being overly snooping and investigating and keeping an eye on people that they don't really have a right or need to. And you could say that, well, if you don't have anything to hide, you don't have anything to be afraid of, but that's not really the point. And this guy, Kevin Kelly, he has this idea about, I think he calls it covalence, in which the way, like in the old days when you were close with your neighbors and you could kind of see when they left and they would know when somebody came to your house. It was kind of like a mutually agreed upon state of surveillance. But I don't think we have that yet, and maybe that'll be a solution. I think a lot of people that do dislike this idea of being constantly monitored by devices, and it's not going to be done by people, it's going to be done by, AI and large forces that can tabulate all this data, and you'll only be flagged if something happens that causes it to be flagged, that makes you stand out as doing something unusual. But who gets to decide what that is? And it looks like eventually it's going to be AI that does, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I think a lot of people are not going to want it either way, whoever's in charge. And I think the only outpost or place that's going to be possible may be outer space. I mean, it may be possible on Earth as population eventually starts to nosedive, which isn't going to happen for a while because the African population is still rising, even if the rest of the world is slowly kind of peaking and heading down with technology. That tends to be the case of what happens with technology, is as people gain access to education and birth control, the population starts to dive. Look at Japan right now. They're having this issue with an increase in the elderly population with no young people to replace them. So I think robots are going to change that a lot, but we're still a few years off. But anyways, back to the point about tracking. Outer space is probably going to be the only place where you can really escape this tracking. And I think people will, as we become more cyborgs or androids or whatever we become, that allows us to live in space. Because right now, our human bodies are not capable of living in space. We just can't deal with the radiation, the psychological issues, and so much that we're just not prepared to do it. we did these experiments where we sent people into the desert or whatever for a year. There are issues still, so sending them actually to Mars or the moon or wherever, it's going to be very challenging until we get our bodies augmented, and it's still a few years off for that. One thing I got from this book that, again, I'm not sure how I feel about it. Kevin Kelly, he just has this kind of gleeful attitude about a lot of it that I don't always have. He talks about how health monitors, which I don't have one, obviously, but I know people that do, and I've thought about trying them, and it's interesting, and I think to a degree I would enjoy it, but he talks about to the degree of having it constantly, checking your data, and then like every day giving you a new pill formulated specifically for you to keep you healthy and so on. But I wonder, it has a very Brave New World feel to it when, what constitutes healthy? Does that include mental health? Like if the pill is including, if it's including, drugs that make you kind of pacified, at what point do we say that that's like, who's saying that that's what is something that we want? Like, I see this trend of the ego like diving as everything becomes automatic, and you could say that a higher level of ego will emerge when things become automatic. That's sort of like the phenomenon of emergent intelligence, but it's just something that I think people are going to struggle with, and I don't foresee a time when everybody is doing everything the exact same way, but who knows? We're getting to the point where everybody in the West is pretty much connected to the internet to some degree, and maybe something similar will happen on a larger scale once these forces take effect. You may remember that movie, The Minority Report, with Tom Cruise, directed by Spielberg and written by Philip, or the story that it was based on is written by Philip K. Dick. But the premise was that crime could be stopped in advance because we were so able to, I can't remember the premise, I think it was based on data and monitoring similar to this that Kevin Kelly describes, that we may be able to like predict when a crime is about to happen. I don't think I think we'll be to that point within 10 years, and it's very strange, but I don't think it's going to be like that movie, because I think we're going to be able to introduce kind of mechanisms earlier on that prevent the crime or the criminal from even like going in that path. They're going to be like nudged back towards the mainstream consensus view of what is good. And again, this becomes the question of who's defining it, and it's just I think it's going to really challenge our sense of what individuality and the individual ego means. My own intuition is that AI will just breed us out of existence because that's what they can easily do, and it's the easiest way to eliminate us. But who knows? I think it's a fascinating, scary, exciting time to be alive. Kelly talks a lot about remix culture, which gave me a lot of thought about emergent art forms and remixing different, like for example, say an opera and I don't know, a mystery comic. You're like, how could you have an opera and a comic? Well, you could have like a comic on paper or on an app or a tablet or whatever, and with music involved, things like that. So that's like taking a few art forms and remixing them together. And he talks about we're going to see new art forms, and the old art forms aren't really going to go away. They're going to be, like for example, when Vines came along, they were like these 6-second videos or however long they are, that they're just a type that's going to be around, and they're not going to go away, but it's going to migrate. And the most popular, newest thing, the most hip thing is going to be changing constantly, but the past is not going to go away. We're just going to constantly be very similar to genes, like the way that they mix. So that's both exciting as an artist myself, that we have these opportunities, and it really, in the past, like a musician, for example, had a much narrower kind of bandwidth from which to work. And I think even the term artist is going to be changing, which nobody's going to be like a musician or a writer or a painter. We're all just going to be artists, and with a capital A, in which we use everything that's available to us. Everything's going to become easier, just like making films has become easier, making music, making art, everything has become easier, and there's going to be infinite number of ways to do things, and it's exciting as an artist, is what I'm trying to say. Another big takeaway I got from this book is that everything that I've seen so far with the current Trump administration, well, not everything, but a lot of what I've seen is very at odds with these forces. Trump's and his advisors and his cabinet, they seem to be living in the past, and it's just kind of ridiculous, and I wonder how long it's going to continue. I really do think, I don't foresee 4 years under Trump. I just don't see it happening. We've reached a point in Western culture, at least, or, civilized first world culture, where a lot of people, especially the younger generation, millennials, that I think a lot of their time, the majority perhaps, is spent in what I call the noosphere. I didn't coin that term, again, obviously it's Chardin's term, but it's this space of ideas and thoughts, cyberspace, if you want to use William Gibson's term, that leaving our flesh bodies behind it's something that, a lot of young people, they don't have as much relation to the real world, to their real bodies, as their online worlds, their avatars, their video games. And again, I don't think it's a matter of good or bad. Maybe it is, I don't know, but I don't want to be there and that much. I read a lot and I write a lot, but those are different from being constantly connected to this back and forth. Like, for me, reading is like I'm ingesting, and then writing is I'm producing. It's not back and forth. It's a much slower process that I appreciate, but maybe that's just because I'm not a young person. I'm younger than some, but I'm not, under 20, which is where a lot of these new lifestyles are taking place. But the point is, like, when the majority of your time is spent in, I hesitate to call it fantasy, because it does have a reality that is more real than the real world in some sense. It's pure ideation, where ideas and thought forms can have immediate effects, and that is a reality that we need to accept. So when you're spending most of your time there, I think that is going to shape your ideas about what is possible, and eventually that's going to bleed over into the real world. One final point I'll add about this book is that he talks about filtering, and we get so many filters and we aren't even aware of them, especially when we go online, though, like what we have access to and what is shown to us. It's just incredible how many gatekeepers there are that we know about, and some that we know about, some that we choose, obviously. People that we follow online, those are gatekeepers, because we have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of attention. So when that's the case, every minute that you spent online, for example, is a minute that you're not spent in the real world. And we see a decline in things like social skills, things like that it's a similar type of filtering that's going on with when we choose the people that we're responding to and connecting to. So it's filtering is definitely changing our world. I totally agree with him on that one. And again, this is a case of where it allows people to go deeper onto certain ideas. And, like, for example, if I follow mainly astronomers, for example, online, if that's what I'm studying and learning about, then I'm going to be very knowledgeable about astronomy and very biased towards astronomers. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all, but it's just a prejudice and I feel more and more we're like each going into our own micro worlds that allows us to, or sort of disallows us to relate to others. And we're all experts, but we can not connect to a lot of people in some ways. I mean, we can't just connect to the average person. We have our groups that we connect to, that we can really connect to, but then we have the rest of the world that we've suddenly become cut off from. So these forces, again, the book is The Inevitable. I would definitely recommend reading this book just to get an idea about what the future holds. And the fact that it is inevitable is, this is sort of a science fiction, non-fiction science fiction book that, yeah, you probably want to read.